Mona stood in front of her mirror, tugging gently at her hair. Her hair used to flow down her back like a waterfall, thick and vibrant. It's probably just stress, she muttered, trying to convince herself. However, when David, her fiancé, noticed it, his concern grew louder. Mona shrugged it off. It's fine, David. Maybe I need a better shampoo. But David wasn't convinced. I'll talk to Jane about it. She's a doctor. She'll know what's going on. Jane, David's sister, was not Mona's biggest fan. She listened to her brother's concerns with exaggerated seriousness. Hair loss? Oh no, David. That sounds like cancer. You can't ignore this. You have to think about your future. What if she doesn't have long time to live? Jane wasted no time informing their parents. Mona's condition is dire. David needs someone healthy like Beauty, my friend with the trust fund. After 2 weeks, Mona began to notice a significant reduction in her hair. She sat on her bed, staring at the mirror. Her heart ached with the uncertainty of it all. She thought she could ignore it, but the worry was consuming her. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David stepped into the room. "Hey," he said gently, sitting close to her. He noticed her avoiding his gaze. "Mona, talk to me. What's going on?" She hesitated, her throat tight. "David, my hair, it's falling out. I don't know what's happening to me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out. I'm here for you, Mona." He drew her closer, cradling her gently in his arms. Mona silently said, "But what if it's something serious? What if I can't give you the life we've been dreaming of?" David's gaze softened. "You don't need to give me anything but your love. That's all I've ever wanted." Mona let out a shaky breath, still unsure. "What if you don't want me when I'm not perfect?" David held her gently. "You're more than perfect to me. And I'm not going anywhere, Mona. We'll face this together. I promise." Later that evening, David sat beside her in the living room as she stared at her phone in silence. "Mona, I need to tell you something. Jane, she thinks it could be cancer. She even told my parents." Mona's heart skipped. "What did she say?" "She said we shouldn't get married, that she might not have long time to live." David's voice cracked. "But Mona, I don't care what she says. I'm not going anywhere." Her mind swirled with confusion and fear. David kissed her forehead softly. "You're not alone in this. No matter what, I'm here with you, always." Mona's tears fell silently. David continued to assure her of his unending love for her. Mona called her mother, who lived 10 miles away, seeking comfort. Without hesitation, her mother urged her to come home immediately. Despite the distance, Mona and David stayed connected. He never missed a chance to call. Mona sat at the dining table, her hands on her head. Her mother, Mrs. Evelyn, talking to her. "Tell me everything you said on the phone, darling." Mona hesitated before explaining everything to her. Mrs. Evelyn reached her. "You listen to me, Mona," she said firmly. "No one, not Jane, not David's parents, gets to decide your future. And I don't believe for a second that this is something you can't overcome. But what if David leaves me?" Mona whispered, her voice breaking. "Has he said he would?" Mrs. Evelyn asked gently. Mona shook her head. "No, he promised to stay. But promises can break." Mrs. Evelyn shifting closer to Mona. "Then let's focus on you, not on what anyone else thinks. I have an idea, but it means going back to my hometown. There's someone who might be able to help." Mrs. Evelyn sat firmly as memories flooded her mind. Her mother's wisdom, the small herbal garden behind their old house, and the way her mother's remedies had healed so many people in their village. She was a healer, Mona. She knew how to use nature to cure what seemed impossible. "I turned away from that life after she passed, but now, I think it's time to go back," Mrs. Evelyn said softly. The next day, Mona and Mrs. Evelyn boarded a bus headed for the small town Mrs. Evelyn had left behind 25 years ago. As they neared the town, Mrs. Evelyn kept on smiling. Mona glanced at her mother. "You never spoke of why you left your town, Mom. Why did you leave?" Mrs. Evelyn's smile faded. "Because I was angry. My mother was a healer. People would come from all over to see her. But she got sick and nothing worked. I could not understand it. I left to escape that pain. But now I think, maybe it's time to face it again." As they arrived at the village, an elderly woman, Mrs. Favor, welcomed them. Mrs. Evelyn introduced Mona to Mrs. Favor as they sat down. Mrs. Favor turned her gaze to Mona, her smile softening. We will see what we can do, dear. God is in control. Inside, the clinic smelled of dried herbs, fresh flowers, and a hint of something earthy and comforting. After listening to Mona's story, Mrs. Favor nodded thoughtfully. Your hair loss is likely caused by hormonal imbalance. It's more common than you think, especially with all the stress and processed foods we deal with these days. The good news is, nature always has a way to restore balance. Where do we start? Mrs. Evelyn asked. First, we detox. It might not taste great, but it'll work wonders. And no complaining, healing starts from the inside out. And your detox will be for some days. Starting from today, no more junk food. You'll eat fresh vegetables, whole grains, and foods that help balance hormones, okay? Mrs. Favor enlightened her. That night, as Mona lay in the small guest room Mrs. Favor had prepared for them, she felt a tiny spark of hope. The fear that had weighed on her for weeks began to lift. David called her just before bed. How's it going? He asked. It's different, Mona admitted, her voice soft. But I think this might actually work. As the call ended, Mona smiled at herself. She felt like she was on the right path to heal her body. Mona and Mrs. Evelyn returned to the city to continue her healing journey through lifestyle changes and proper nutrition after 1 month with Mrs. Favor. During their stay, Mrs. Favor introduced Mona to a nourishing natural hair treatment, a blend of castor oil, rosemary, coconut oil, fenugreek seeds, and flax seeds crafted to restore her hair's health and vitality. With this regimen, she also introduced her to wild yam cream, advising her to rub a small amount on her arms daily to help balance hormones naturally. Within 7 months, 8 months into her healing journey, Mona stood before the mirror in David's room, running her fingers through her fuller, healthier hair, a testament to her transformation. Her confidence had returned, shining brighter than ever. David walked in. Mona, he said softly, his voice filled with wonder. You're absolutely breathtaking. She stepped into his arms, wrapping him in a tender embrace. Looking up into his eyes, she whispered, It's been such a long journey, David, but you never gave up on me. David gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheek. I never could. Watching you bloom like this, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a slow, heartfelt kiss. Later, they sat close together on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder as they talked about their upcoming wedding. I want every detail to reflect us, David said, running his fingers through her hair. Our love, our journey, everything we've overcome. Mona smiled. All I need is you by my side. The rest is just a bonus. David chuckled, pulling her closer. Then we're already winning. A few months later, Mrs. Evelyn watched with pride as her daughter walked confidently down the aisle, her hair thick, long and radiant. Mona and David stood at the altar, their vows filled with promises of love and resilience. After the wedding, Mrs. Evelyn visited Mrs. Favor to thank her. My mother's knowledge saved my daughter, she said, with joy. Mrs. Favor smiled. Your mother's legacy lives on, Evelyn. Never doubt the power of nature. Back home, Mrs. Evelyn set up a small herb garden, determined to keep her mother's wisdom alive. And Mona? She never missed a day of tea or hair oil, knowing that sometimes the best remedies come straight from the earth, as she extends it to her husband.